have a continent-wide plan for a united or common economic and industrial program for Africa. This plan should include for setting up a common market for Africa, an African currency, African monetary zone, for a continent knit together in common policy and common purpose. We shall have made the finest possible contribution to that peace for which all men and women thirst today. Africa must unite.
10 years ago, in 2013, African head of state and government officials gathered in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and ratified a momentous plan called Silencing the Gun in Africa by 2023. Yet that ambitious, momentous plan was not attainable, and then the African Union extended the plan to 2030. Still, some are skeptical of whether African states can create a conflict-free continent. Hello and welcome, viewers. This is our weekly messenger. In today's edition, we're going to take a look at the root cause of conflict in Africa and the way forward. And for this, I'm joined by Dr. Agnes Behr, who is Assistant Professor of Foreign Policy and Diplomacy at the United States International University. Please do stay with us. So, Dr. Agnes studied a lot on security in Africa: violence, terrorism, counter-terrorism, good governance, democracy, identity, and race are some of her research area. So we are reaching Dr. Agnes Behr via Skype. She is in Nairobi, Kenya today. Hello, Doctor.
Hello, good morning.
Fantastic to meet you, Dr. Agnes. So let's start the talk with a very fresh conflict here in Ethiopia's neighbor, Sudan. Following the war, following the conflict between Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces, thousands of Sudanese died, millions are displaced. So the question is, was this war avoidable or something inevitable?
Thank you very much for your question. And looking at Sudan, I would say that the war in Sudan, or the conflict in Sudan, was inevitable.
Inevitable.
Why inevitable? Because you are looking at two military forces, the central military and the paramilitary force, coming at loggerheads. Yet we know very well that what started the problems in Sudan was the civilians' agitation for their rights and democracy, human rights and democracy. But where we are at now, we are seeing two military or armed forces that are loggerheads at each other, and the civilians have been set aside. So the question is, was the cause addressed, or was the cause nearly being addressed? And you can see that it was not. So the fact that the issues that were raised by civilians were not addressed and actually morphed into a power struggle between the military and the paramilitary force tells you that this war was inevitable, because instead of dealing with what they needed to deal with, which was actually transitioning to democracy from al-Bashir's rule, they actually transitioned to military rule. So this war was inevitable, and if you can go back maybe a little bit to see what al-Bashir did, he saw that previous governments had been ousted via coups. And so to protect himself, he had to surround himself with these so-called powerful military forces and a paramilitary force, which is problematic in itself, because the state military ought to be there to protect the civilians and the government. So when you introduce a paramilitary force, what are you saying? You are actually challenging the state military at that point, and therefore setting aside the civilians at that point. So I would say the war or the conflict was inevitable.
All right. As far as many social science researchers are concerned, Africans are in a vicious circle. Why can't Africans break this vicious circle and move to a kind of virtuous circle whereby peoples of Africa can live in a permanent and sustainable peace? Why Africans can't build a permanent peace?
The problems in Africa are not completely coming from Africa itself. Some of these problems are actually perpetuated by forces beyond the continent of Africa. Mm-hmm. And so the reason why you see Africa failing to have this sustainable peace, if you may put it that way, or virtuous peace like you want to look at, is because of what I would call three geographies. So you have the traditional borders of states in Africa, which are supposed to govern these states. Then you have transboundary relations. These are socio-cultural relations that exist beyond the borders of a state. So people cannot be confined with these borders of a state. And then you have the third aspect, which is the presence of the state itself or the institution of the state, but it's only prominent in urban areas, meaning the machineries of power in a state are very weak in the peripheral areas. So the state can only control urban centers. Then there's these transcultural, transboundary relations that go beyond the borders of a state, and then you're trying to impose the borders of a state. So when these three things come together, there is constant, what I would call conflict that is either overt or covert going on. And so it becomes very difficult to contain Africa in a state of what I would call constant peace. So you have this perpetual conflict, either overt or covert, going on that cannot really be contained. And this is because of the introduction, of course, of forces beyond the continent that the continent cannot avoid dealing with. Identity politics, to a large extent, contributes a lot to this absence of peace in Africa. Why? Because it is used as a card by the politicians to secure power and retain power. So they will consolidate those identities that are from their own group and then segregate those ones that are not from their own identity group and marginalize them. And this introduces the issue of injustice in a state. With injustice in a state, there is only one route: political mobilization and uprising to topple a government so as to try and bring about justice in these type of states. And because of this, you find that African continent as a whole is perpetually facing issues of conflict, which cannot be avoided unless we address issues of justice and wealth distribution to all political identities that are found within each state.
The problem of identity politics in Africa has something to do with colonization. So how colonization portrays identity as an important play card in African politics?
Colonial government we are talking about, whether it is French, whether you're talking about the English, had to use something in order to contain the larger, because the machinery of government there was thin. I mean, the number of colonies that were present in African states were fewer compared to the local population. So how do you then prevent local population from mobilizing against you, who is seen as an outsider, who's come to use force in these states? What you do is to divide these, what I would call ethnic identities, bring some under your wing, and of course put some further away from power. And so by using identities, for example, if I may just look at Kenya, for example, you would see that certain ethnic groups were brought closer to the colonial government. And so you'd find the Kikuyus, the Luos, the prominent ethnic communities coming closer to power. And of course, those who were at the peripheral, and like I said earlier, remember the three geographies, you had the socio-cultural, you had the borders, and then of course you had the machinery of state. Machinery of state was more powerful in urban areas. So those who were the peripheral were neglected, if I may put it that way, because the resources could not really develop the whole country. And so those who are closer to power, and in Kenya's example, you see that central Kenya is closer to the capital of Nairobi. So you see the infrastructure and machinery government at least reaching these areas. So this ethnic group is seen to be benefiting from what the colonial powers left behind. And of course, there were also tags that went along with communities. So others were labeled as lazy, others were labeled as good for being askaris or guards, and others were labeled as just being for farm hands and all that. These derogatory labels would continue to be used in these post-colonial states, and unfortunately, to the detriment of now the governments that will come later into power, because the tags will continue to show these some ethnic groups as, inferior to others. So it's almost like you're looking at racism.
How identity politics is negatively affecting African peace, security, and democracy?
You've introduced a third, should I say, issue, which is democracy. What is democracy? Democracy is the rule by majority, yeah? So you go into voting, and whoever gets elected through majority votes goes on to form a government. But now when you come to Africa, how do you gain the majority? You have political parties in Africa, just like you have in Europe, North America. But the difference between African political parties and European political parties and North American political parties is the issue of ideology. In Europe, you'd have ideology running political parties. So someone will support a political party based on its ideology because they identify without ideology. When you come to Africa, people would run political parties based on identity, and this is ethnic identity. So you see people voting or being mobilized along ethnic lines, such that you see this ethnic group will vote in this particular political party, this one will vote in this particular political party. So the democracy that you are having here is not a democracy of issues. So it's not solving the issues within the state. It's only just a channel or a conduit to elect a person who a people identify with ethnically. And unfortunately, the leaders use this ethnic, should I say, card to mobilize people. So by the time you're forming a government, you are really not forming a democratic government. You are forming an ethnic government. And of course, this goes on to cause problems in terms of legitimacy of this government. We saw Kenya going into chaos in 2007, 2008. Why? Because apparently the government that was elected was seen to have been rigged in through ethnic card. So they could not accept, the rest of the opposition could not accept this. This has gone on in Nigeria again. We've seen that regionalism and of course ethnicity has also been plaguing this particular country in terms of democracy. So what we are looking at as democracy in Africa, in fact, has been argued that cannot bring peace into these countries. Why? Because the democracy we are seeing is a majoritarian, or what I would call presidential democracy, where winner takes it all. So if you're saying winner takes it all, yet you've been elected through an ethnic card, what does that mean? It means the opposition will perpetually feel a sense of injustice and will perpetually feel that this government is actually legitimate, because it's not to win because of solve issues, but won because of this ethnic card that was used. So this has been the problem almost across all the across the continent of Africa. Whether you're going to look at Nigeria, whether you're going to look at Siad Barre, when he was ousted. He was ousted because despite preaching the issues of course, removing clanism in the country, he will go on to favor certain three ethnic groups, three clans, and these clans were associated with either himself or his in-laws, where he had married from. And so this brought again issues of injustice. And you can see democracy, as we call it in Africa, is really not democracy, but something that is attempting to transition from autocratic government to what you will call democracy. So we are really not there because of this issue of identity, specifically ethnic or clan identities. Yeah.
Identities everywhere. Go Europe, America, identities everywhere. But in Africa, identity is becoming a curse, a problem for African politics. For instance, let's take the experience of Europe. Let's take United Kingdom, for example. There are different identities there. Scottish is there, Irish, Welsh, English. But these diverse identities do not hamper the country's road to peace, democracy, and prosperity. But why Africans fail to manage identity politics?
Looking at Europe, for example, people are voting, like I said, political parties based on ideologies. So at the end of the day, whoever wins would not be questioned, and no one would really care much who becomes, for example, a prime minister after an election, because they know that the institution of government will protect them from abuse of power by this particular elected individual. And there's also a very good provision when it comes to abuse of power. If a prime minister, for example, of the UK abused power today, remember this is a parliamentary democracy. This person will be removed from power through parliamentary vote. And then another one will be re-elected and put into power. But Africa, we've moved, in fact, most African countries, upon independence that were parliamentary democracy, would morph into either what I'll call autocratic governments, or would go to presidential democracy. Presidential democracy is winner takes it all. And all powers are centralized to the president, meaning the president can call shots whichever way he wishes. And again, to remove the president is very, very difficult, meaning vote of no confidence for presidential democracy is very difficult. And so this notion of winner takes it all, and you know that once this person is there, the institutions are weak, cannot protect you, becomes problematic for Africa. But in Europe or in America, you can see the strong institution guards against abuse of power by those who are elected. Hence why people would really not fear that much who is elected in these particular nations. And I think we saw this during the Trump era, when Trump became a bit, or should I say a lot problematic. We would see what ended up. He did not go, he could not win the second term. Mm-hmm. But in Africa, second term of government is normally when you see a eruption of violence, because this person is already controlling the machineries of government, the military and everything else, power, wealth and all that. And they will use government resources to secure a second term for governance. And it's impossible, almost impossible not to deal with this person. That's what happened in Kenya, because 2002 President Kibaki was elected peacefully. 2007, when he tried to be ousted, he used machineries of power and came back. And then Kenya deteriorated into that particular conflict. Al-Bashir tried also to use machineries of power, hence the introduction of RSF, of course. But what has that resulted to? What we are seeing as perpetual conflict, and hence the difference between managing, should I say, peace or conflict in Africa vis-a-vis North America and Europe. Institutions, it's all about institutions, all about legitimacy, and all about power. Where is power? How is it distributed?
All right. Dr. Agnes, let me move you to economic affairs in Africa. Some says poverty is the mother of all problems, and if African countries can successfully beat poverty, they could have managed identity politics and conflicts that arise from identity politics. So what is your idea? What is your argument in this regard?
This is a very interesting one. Some say that it's impossible for Africa to democratize because of poverty. And others say, no, it's actually because of poverty that you need to democratize. So the question comes, is poverty the problem, or is poverty the outcome of poor governance? And yes, if you have resources in a country, I would say you probably would have a chance at having better governance and, of course, strong institutions. Because remember, we are talking all along about democracy. This issue called democracy, it's a process. It's not just the election day that you call democracy. You have preparation of the masses, civic education, you have civil society, institution, international organizations, and all that. You have the electoral body. All this requires resources. And so if you look at democracy in Africa, it therefore heavily relies on external resources to keep it standing. So this is where you can say that the issue of poverty is contributing to conflict or to absence of peace. But the question here, or the problem here, is what are we doing with all the resources that we have? Most of it is either embezzled through corruption, hence perpetuating poverty. The other one is, with these resources, African countries failed to industrialize. So you have resources which you are should I say, mining and exporting to Europe, wherever, out there. You get very little for these raw resources. They convert these resources into finished products and sell them back to Africa. So with the aid that you have received as an African country, you're actually buying the resources that you emanated or originated from your own country. So you are trapped in this perpetual form of poverty. So yes, I would say poverty is a problem, but it is not as easy to remove it as we would want to see it, because it is not just Africa that is contributing to this poverty through corruption. We also have Europe, which created these structures of economic interdependence, where Africa is forced to channel its raw resources to Europe. They do finished product and then they sell it back to us. If I may quote Nyerere in early 60s, Nyerere actually said the problem of Africa is they consume what they do not produce and produce what they do not consume. Because if you're going to produce something that you're not consuming, then what are you consuming and where are you getting it from? You're getting it from outside, finished product. What are you producing? Raw materials. And raw materials, by nature, they have lower value than finished products. So Africa is therefore perpetually caught between this, should I say, balance of payment deficit.
And then how should African countries should jointly work to boost their economy?
Well, we've tried to have, for example, South African Development Cooperation, East African Community, IGAD, ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States. If you look at this, it's like an attempt to try and trade within these regional blocks. But then the question I want to ask is, let me just pick, for example, East African Community, where you have Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, and is it South Sudan, these 7 countries. Let me ask you, from just painting a picture, what can these countries trade together? Because if you look at Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, I dare say maybe South Sudan has got resources, oil resources, so that's slightly different. But if you look at them, they have
the same
common
product.
goods. Same products. So how are they going to trade together? And then if you look at South Sudan now with the oil, and they do not process it into a finished product. So they export it out there to be processed into a finished product, then we import it back. So you can see trade within this group becomes a bit problematic. And if you look at the whole African continent, if I'm going to go to a broader perspective, you would see that there's something very, very worrisome that is invading inter or intra-African trade. You have these hegemonic states like Nigeria in ECOWAS, Economic Community of West Africa, then South Africa in SADC, I dare say Kenya in East Africa, and then if you look at, of course, Central Africa, if you look at CENSAD, you would have Democratic Republic of Congo. These countries, and Angola, if you look at Angola again in SADC, these countries that have got a certain mineral resource, if I may call it that is very, should I say, desired by the outside world, have found themselves being linked in bilateral trade with extra African countries, like you see European Union dealing with Nigeria, Angola, and then China again dealing with South Sudan, Sudan, Angola, and DRC, and so to speak. And then you have got those ones who are coming through the back door, like Russia, of course, dealing with certain countries again in this continent. So you see, intra-African trade is not bereft of external interference. Because once, for example, you have entered a bilateral deal with a hegemonic state like Nigeria in oil, or Angola, or Democratic Republic of Congo, or Libya, or whatever, these countries lose the interest of intra-African trade because they're already having the client outside the continent. Do you see? So it becomes, again, problematic. And then there is another problem that I see here, because we are preaching issues of liberalism, and we are preaching issues of democracy, which encourages globalization. And at the same time, we are trying to come back into the African cocoon. How do we do this with globalization? So there are a lot of challenges that you can see hinder intra-African trade, if I may say so. And there is no way you're going to introduce democratization, human rights, liberalism, and again contain Africa in a cocoon to work alone by itself. So there is need for African, I would say, heads of states and government to come together and seriously draw a map on how to approach world trade so as to secure the resources that they have, and of course to make them stronger when dealing with the outside or extra-continental powers. But we know how that went when Africa tried at the incept, when, before it became, before formation of Organization of African Unity. We know how that went. It could not work. So would it work right now? I think that's a big question that just leave hanging there.
Yes. Proponents of African unity, proponents of African prosperity also recommends that Africans need to have a common market. But still, trade and investment between and among African states is very, very low. Why so? What are the setbacks in this regard?
The major setback of Africa to Africa trade is these linkages to their former colonial powers. And it's not just that link only. We have infrastructure that was created to favor this trade between former colonies and former colonial masters. So how do you cut this tie and then bring back to Africa? It becomes a bit difficult. So you would see that Africans also, this issue of, like we touched earlier before, of identity and class has come to interfere with the social psychological aspect of the Africans. Meaning, if Kenya, for example, is producing a particular product, and Europe, let's say UK, is producing a particular product, you would see that Kenyans would be inclined to buy that which is made in Europe vis-a-vis that which is made in Kenya. Why? Because of the notion of the superior sense of that which is European vis-a-vis that which is in Africa. And the same thing is actually, this problem is even bigger when you go to former, what I call Francophone countries. Francophone countries prefer to trade or to buy products made in France. People prefer to buy clothes made in France than to buy clothes made from local production. So you can see there is a social psychological problem of looking at African products or made in Africa as inferior vis-a-vis made in Europe or made in America. So how are we going to deal with this issue? So you can see colonialism was not only the conquest of what I would say territory, but the conquest of the mind. How to remove that conquest of the mind has remained a big problem in Africa, and I think continues to haunt even what we are looking at, wealth creation by Africans in Africa.
African unity is also hampered by so many factors. What are the cancers of African unity? Can we see the major factors that hindered African unity?
Yes. Like I said, when we started this interview, I would say you would look at this notion of Francophone, Anglophone. It's very big. And if I may just scale it down maybe to West Africa, look at Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS. ECOWAS has tried to consolidate itself in terms of enhancing trade among that particular bloc and enhancing peace and security among that particular bloc. But guess what? Every time there is a problem, for example, eruption of conflict in Mali, what did the Malians do? They rush to look for France to come and help them. What did African Union do? African Union, by the time it's producing a solution, France is already on the ground. Go again to, let me just go to Central African states there. When CAR, Central African Republic, was faced with problems, or has been faced with problems, the African Union is the last actually to be part of a solution. France is there because it's a former colonial master. And then, unfortunately, now we have the entrance of Russia. Russia is there trying to prop up security around the president. And then by the time you're bringing African Union, you would see that these extra continental powers are already on the ground. So, and remember, African Union, one of the biggest challenge that it faces is the issue of funding. So all these things that are required to, should I say, proper peace and security require funding. And the funding, most of the time, has always come from outside the continent. So this absence of funding is the second challenge. So the first challenge, I would say, former colonial powers being more prominent on the ground than the African Union itself. Then you have the issue of funding, such that by the time even the African Union came up with this notion of African solutions to African problems, then the question becomes, how do you propose a solution you cannot fund? You get it? So this becomes problematic. The other problem that has come, which is global, is the issue of terrorism and, of course, counter-violent extremism. So this is an amorphous, I would say, enemy that continues to haunt the continent. And like I said, if you go back to the shortcomings of peace in Africa, the three geographies that I called, the third one was the state and state machinery being present mostly in urban areas. What does that mean? The peripherals are free for all to roam. And so this monster of terrorism, counter-violence, extremism, of course, finds this niche where the state power is thin or state presence is thin, finds that niche to hide in and, of course, terrorize the people of the continent and so forth. So all this, of course, culminating with issues of poverty, identity, has made African Union to become, to have, should I say, a big challenge in terms of containing the issues in the continent.
Good.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Agnes, we are about to finalize our interview. The future is on us. We can definitely build the Africa we want. So my last question to you is, what is expected from African youth in building bright and united Africa?
This is a very interesting one, and I would not pretend to have a direct answer or a solid answer to this. But what we are seeing with the African youth is this, should I say, thin allegiance to ethnicity. The African youths really are not what I would say die-hard ethnic, should I say, supporters. And so you can see this integration of African youths across ethnic divides being a positive thing, if I may call it that way. And so I would say, first of all, diluting the notion of ethnicity as a form of governance to go into issue areas would really help when we look at the African youth. But that I can say would just be hearsay. If we can be able to prop up the youth, of course, through education and, of course, through other conduits of self-help programs, then maybe we can be able to, should I say, slay this monster of insecurity and absence of peace in the continent. But that's a very big question that I cannot pretend to have a serious or a solid answer towards. Yes.
All right. All right. Dr. Agnes, we have run out of time, but I have to thank you very much. Dr. Agnes Behr, Assistant Professor of Diplomacy and Foreign Policy at the United States International University. Really thank you very much for your golden perspective and incredible insights, and I hope I will see you in another show. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
This is all I have for you for today. Many thanks for watching, and see you then.
A continent-wide plan for a united or common economic and industrial program for Africa. This plan should include for setting up a common market for Africa, an African currency, African monetary zone, for a continent knit together in common policy and common purpose. We shall have made the finest possible contribution to that peace for which all men and women thirst today. Africa must unite.